everyone joining us virtually here. Thanks for being here. As the organizer of these events, I'm responsible for introductions, so I'll just say quickly, my name is Emma, and I'm an instructor with the Department of Religion and Culture here. And I'm so pleased to be introducing Bastami Bilgic today. Dr. Bilgic recently joined the Religion and Culture Department of Virginia Tech as an adjunct instructor. He holds a PhD in history from the George Washington University. He has published books and articles on late Ottoman and modern Turkish politics, and his current research is on the relationship between the state and Islam during the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. Dr. Biljic's research has been sponsored by prestigious institutions such as the Onassis Foundation in Greece, the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Turkish Historical Society in Turkey, and the Greta Henkel Foundation in Germany. So let's welcome Bastami here.
Thank you.
I'll slip by here.
Okay.
Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Emma, for the generous introduction. Before I start with the presentation, I would like to share a note with you. This is a research I've been conducting with a colleague. I have a co-researcher, Dr. Hakkı Taş, of the German Institute for Global Affairs in Hamburg, Germany. So if there is any merit to this research, and this research, half the credit at least goes to my dear friend and colleague Hakkı. Okay, so without further ado, perhaps I should begin. In 1923, following a national struggle against the post-World War I occupation forces, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk rose to prominence as both the savior and revolutionary leader of the newly formed Republic of Turkey. Kemal's determination that Turkey would be modern and Turkish required a drastic socio-political transformation, ushered in with a broad program of reforms known generally as Kemalism. The scholarly writings on these foundational years refer to the existence of a particularly Kemalist brand of secularism that is systematized as a single legible whole. Inspired by the fixed formal categories of American secularism and French laïcité, or adding to the tabulation new categories such as semi-secularism, assertive secularism, or accommodationist secularism, analyses of Kemalism assume a somewhat coherent, sustained political cultural system. Such typologies accompany the observation that the Kemalists' religious conception can be reduced to a formula such as enlightened Islam, in quotations, or Turkish nationalism can be reduced to a civil religion, replacing the Islamic faith. A more careful observation, however, reveals the empirical complexity of Kemalist practices, which seemed to be ad hoc responses to changing circumstances rather than a natural outcome of a well-planned reform project. Multiple contradictory discourses on Islam coexisted and were simultaneously propagated by the Kemalist regime. For instance, 3 different depictions of Prophet Muhammad appeared in the 1930s, a decade dubbed as the decade of high Kemalism. First, by adopting a distant, positivistic language for Islam, the regime's history textbook treated religion as a sociocultural construct, relegating revelation to myth and the prophet as merely a concerned man who tried to change society for the better and declared his prophethood out of sincere enthusiasm. Second, the new Turkish call to prayer, Adhan, the state introduced in 1932 as part of the broader initiative promoting a nationalized vernacular Islam, declared Muhammad the messenger of God, Tanrı'nın elçisi in Turkish, throughout the streets 5 times a day. Lastly, in the Friday sermons, the government distributed to mosques yet another depiction of Muhammad arose alongside eulogistic titles in Ottoman or Arabic, including Resul-i Zishan, which means the glorious prophet, in harmony with the conventional practices of Sunni Islam. Each instance requires detailed investigation, since such a pragmatic multiplicity of discourses cannot be simply reduced to a single category to identify Kemalist secularism and Islam against. Though Islam in school and atop the minaret have been studied, Islam in the mosque during the formative years of the Turkish Republic has received a rather scant attention. This research aims to fill this gap by delving into the origins of the state's production of Islamic sermons among Kemalism's most blatant and uninterrupted religious practices. To do so, this research considers two sermon anthologies produced by the Presidency of Religious Affairs, which is known as the Diyanet in Turkish. The first anthology is the 1927 edition, which is called Türkçe Hutbe. And the second one is Yeni Hutbelerim, My New Sermons, released in 1936 and 1937. These earlier texts of Friday sermons remain unexplored as part of a substantial textual analysis of the Islam preached by the Kemalist state. Perhaps I should just sit a little bit.
Sure.
And the mask is not helping a lot. Breathing thing.
If you want to take it off, I think that would be okay for
The mask, yep.
as the speaker, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So for this inquiry, the Ottoman text in the first anthology was transliterated into the Latin script because it was published in the Ottoman script. Additionally, to contextualize these works, this research relies on extensive historical research, including the collection and analysis of official documents, late Ottoman periodicals, and early Republican media sources. You can see the cover pages of these two earlier sermon anthologies on the PowerPoint. This research investigates the establishment of a centralized sermon regime by the founding elite to demonstrate the entangled nature of the Kemalists' approach to Islam. Rather than the prevailing categories, which assume a coherent programmatic agenda in Kemalism, it focuses on the composite character of early Republican practices to elucidate the empirical complexity and ambivalence of the founding ideology. The larger goal here is to provide a fine-grained analysis of how the state's relationship with Islam was negotiated, reconstructed, and consolidated throughout the first decades of the Turkish Republic. Between the late Ottoman debates on Muslim preaching and modern Turkey's novel logic of national citizenship, the production and practice of Turkish Friday sermons offer a unique opportunity to deconstruct the official Islam, in quotations again, during the early Republican era, and help one better understand the Kemalist state's approach to Islam. To trace and contextualize the discourses in the initial texts of the Turkish Friday sermons, this study first elaborates on the late Ottoman debates on why and how the Friday sermons should be modernized, including switching their language from Arabic to Turkish. This will also help bridge the divide between the separately developing Ottoman and Republican studies on Friday sermons. The research then traces the establishment of a sermon regime centralized by the Republican elite, alongside debates on the modernization and nationalization of religion. The next section undertakes a detailed analysis of the first sermons in Turkish to illustrate how diverse motives and actors contributed to the crafting of Islam in the mosque. Lastly, the analysis is situated within the wider debate on secularism in Turkey. Okay, so this is a pulpit from Ankara. This is a mosque from the 13th century, actually. The Friday sermon, hutbeh, is a brief oration delivered from the pulpit in the mosque by an imam or assigned preacher, and it is an integral part of Friday prayers. In Islam, it is mandatory for all adult Muslim men to attend this congregational service and listen to the sermon. In the formative years of Islam, a community leader would take the pulpit as preacher. This was a precedent set by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina himself. Congregational prayer, bringing ruler and the rule together, became a unique platform in which Muslim worship was inextricably linked to political authority. The sermon then became not only a major channel of moral exhortation and remembrance of God, but also a public forum for official communication and the confirmation of political loyalties. Over time, the performance of sermons changed significantly, with rulers appointing trusted scholars to preach on their behalf, beginning in the late 7th century. As part of this newly established practice, preachers had to conclude their sermons with a blessing of the caliph or ruler. This invocation functioned as the most important insignia of a ruler's sovereignty. Second, while retaining its symbolic power, the preaching of sermons gradually came to embody the high art of oratory and eloquence. Sermons, however, written stylistically with archaic grammar and vocabulary, sermons became increasingly irrelevant and incomprehensible to listeners. In time, preachers fell into the convenience of memorizing and reciting centuries-old sermons. The obsolescence of this authoritative channel of political, ethical instruction grew more apparent under the reign of non-Arab Muslim empires, eras when sermons continued to be delivered in Arabic. In the Ottoman Empire, a practice called kürsü şehliği was initiated in grand imperial mosques to make sermons intelligible to the faithful. Accordingly, a preacher would offer a brief vernacular explanation of the sermon following the Friday prayer. Yet the number of the mosques maintaining this communal service was quite limited. Only a few such places of worship existed in the 15th century, when it was first implemented by Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror. This number had risen to 33 by the demise of the Ottoman Empire. Available evidence suggests that the problem did not attract much public attention until the second half of the 19th century. Ali Suabi, which we a picture of who you can see on the PowerPoint, a member of the ulema, was one of its pioneering intellectuals who, as early as 1870, sarcastically purported the futility of preaching sermons in Arabic. The title is Zamane Hutbesi. It's in Ottoman script, it's in Turkish. That's an excerpt from the article he wrote in his own journal called Ulum. But one had to wait for the commencement of the second constitutional period in 1908 and the initial liberal environment it affected for a wider discussion at the center of the empire on the content and language of Friday sermons. It was Halim Sabit, an emigre scholar from the Russian Empire, he was originally. He seemed to have initiated these debates in Istanbul with his articles in the Islamist journal Sırat-ı Müstakim, which means the true path, or the righteous path. He contended that in Islam's formative years, Friday sermons were meant to provide the faithful with both religious and political advice. While disseminating the basic teachings of Islam, they could be effective channels to encourage Muslims to fight valiantly in defense of religion, nation, and the homeland, Vatan. Yet, for Friday sermons to perform that function, not only the content, but also the language had to change. However, during the Ottoman rule, many preachers had little to no command of Arabic. They preached from memory or from an anthology on issues that were temporally or contextually irrelevant. Parallel to the demands of Halim Sabit and many others following suit, Islam Dünyası, which means the world of Islam, another Islamist journal, published a couple of Friday sermons in Turkish in 1914. The journal also asked the office of the Sheikhul Islam, the Meshihat, to prepare a modern sermon anthology. However, the Meshihat issued a religious ruling in 1914 that proscribed the delivery of Friday sermons in Turkish. This matter was closed temporarily, with the Ottoman government eschewing the much anticipated production of a Turkish sermon anthology, comprising the various social and religious concerns of Muslims. The issue was rekindled in 1920 after a revolutionary government was installed in Ankara after the effective demise of the Ottoman Empire. A resistance movement against the occupation emerged under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal in 1919 after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. During the national struggle of 1919-1922, sermons were used by mosques to galvanize popular support and reverberate with prayers for the Ankara government. Mehmet Akif, a prominent intellectual known for his Islamist views, toured Anatolia and used his addresses at mosques to invite the faithful to support the resistance movement. The themes in Mehmet Akif's homilies, including the notion of jihad as a defense of the homeland or the need for Muslims to gain material strength, would later find their way into the Diyanet's inaugural sermon anthologies. Without hesitation, Akif assimilated the usage of Tanrı, which is an archaic Turkish word for God, and allegedly typical post-Republican Kemalist nomenclature. Akif also provided short Turkish translations of Quranic verses and declared that the wretched state of the Muslims was due to their lack of proper understanding of the Holy Book. He alluded to the necessity of Quranic translation, which would allow the faithful to comprehend its messages. Mustafa Kemal Pasha himself displayed a keen interest in Friday sermons. In his introductory remarks in the parliament in March 1922, he asked the Şeriye Vekaleti Minister of Religious Affairs to render sermons comprehensible to the people. I quote, "Should the Friday sermons be delivered from the pulpits in a language understandable by the public and thus address the souls and the minds of the people, the Muslims would be rejuvenated, their minds would be purified, their faith would grow stronger, and their heart would find courage." Upon the abolition of the caliphate in March 1924, the name of the caliph in the Friday sermons was immediately replaced with prayers for the nation and the republic. This is the letter sent from Ankara, from Diyanet, to the Mufti's offices across the country. This is dated 1924, right after the abolition of the caliphate. A few months later, the Diyanet asked preachers, with this circular actually, to avoid discussing political matters in their sermons. The most significant changes, however, would come after a parliamentary debate in 1925. A deputy complained that the current practice of Friday sermons was nothing more than mere musical recitations, which the religion had presumably forbidden. He asked the Diyanet to end this practice and have sermons delivered in Turkish, since prophets addressed their followers only in languages they would understand. Another deputy maintained that the imams should stop discussing esoteric matters like the afterlife. They should instead, in his opinion, focus on concrete topics such as governance, economy, or people's livelihoods. Taking the issue one step further, Sheikh Saffet Efendi, a prominent religious dignitary who was also sitting in the parliament, said that the reading of the sermons in Turkish could not be left to the discretion of individual imams, most of whom were incapable of deciding what to talk about every day. The Diyanet should therefore prepare a Turkish anthology of sermons to be distributed to imams around the country. Imams could then choose a sermon that suited the specific time of the year. Considering these debates, it was significant that arguments in favor of the Turkification and modernization of Friday sermons were articulated with Islamic reason. In an apparent pursuit of more exhaustive and authoritative work, two more deputies submitted a motion on the same day and asked the Diyanet to prepare a sermon anthology in Turkish and enforce an edict to deliver Friday sermons in Turkish. The government approved this request, and a few months later, in June 1925, the Diyanet issued a circular to the offices of the muftis, the provincial and district representatives of the Diyanet across the country, about the changes made to the deliverance of Friday sermons. That circular declared that the purpose of sermons was to praise God, hail Muhammad as God's messenger, remind the faithful to follow them both, and offer instruction about the precepts of Islam as well as national matters. Hence, a commission was formed, and those interested in contributing to the Turkish anthology of sermons were to send drafts to Diyanet by the end of the year. The authors of the selected sermons were to be duly rewarded. The Diyanet provided certain guidelines regarding the sermons. In both the first and second parts of the sermon, God would be praised, and Prophet would be saluted in Arabic as before, but the admonition, mev'ize, would be read aloud in Turkish. The admonition could pertain to creed, worship, morality, hard work, or thrift. Relevant Quranic verses and hadith should be recited in Arabic with Turkish translations provided. Following the council, prayers should be invoked in Turkish, and lastly, all sermons should end with the recitation of Quran 1690, which reads, "Indeed, Allah orders justice and good conduct and giving to relatives and forbids immorality and bad conduct and oppression. He admonishes you that perhaps you will be reminded." The Diyanet was, however, unable to immediately produce a sermon anthology. While a number of Friday sermons were prepared and sent to the provinces the next year, 2 years would pass before the Diyanet released its own sermon anthology, Türkçe Hutbe, which included 51 sermons. The second edition was published in 1928 due to increased demand, and the third expanded edition, My New Sermons, was published in 1936 and 1937 in 2 volumes containing 151 sermons in total. Shying away from the anonymous authorship in the first 2 editions, Ahmet Hamdi Akseki, who was the vice president of the Diyanet, appeared as the author of the final edit, suggesting that he contributed as an author or editor in prior editions. This is a letter from the Diyanet again to the provinces that they were sending the anthologies produced or published in Ankara. Just as the pioneers in the second constitutional era advocated, the Kemalists approached sermons as a genre of mass media. While the regime embarked upon a profound mission of state and nation building, its limited resources, low literacy rates, and lacking tools of mass communication determined its capacity to disseminate messages. As such, sermons as a pre-established medium of mass communication appealed to the ruling elite. Yet, the Kemalists' approach to sermons differs from their predecessors in 2 fundamental ways. The first is ideological. The founding elite was especially influenced by Ziya Gökalp, the ideologue of Turkish nationalism. Gökalp most succinctly encapsulated his views on this matter in his 1923 work, The Foundations of Turkism, Türkçülüğün Esasları, which provided the groundwork for the young republic's reform policies on Islam. While the main project Gökalp outlined was one of religious reform in preparation for a Turkish Renaissance, he cited Turkish Friday sermons as a pillar of what he called religious Turkism, dini Türkçülük. Sharing Gökalp's ideal, the parliament decided to produce Turkish translations of the Quran, its exegesis, an extensive commentary, as well as a compilation of reliable hadith. Having such sources in a national vernacular was expected to pave the way to a Turkish religious renaissance. These changes were also deemed conducive to forming a national religion. Second, because sermons were expected to perform a pedagogical function, it was crucial that imams and preachers were incorporated into the nation-building project. Contrary to their early political role in the public recognition of the ruler's legitimacy, sermons now became a pedagogical technique for the dissemination of the attitudes and orientations appropriate to a modern national citizenry. And while the founding elite had such expectations, Diyanet officials, not the least of whom being Akseki, made their own calculations. In what Amit Bey'in called qualified cooperation, many ulema or Islamist figures adopted the lesser of 2 evils by seeking a balance between the demands of the new regime and their own religious pursuits. Akseki provided an enlightened taste of Islam that would please the Kemalist ruling elite, while contradictorily promoting what could be designated as traditional Islam. In this regard, sermons expounded practical Islamic norms on day-to-day religious obligations and conveyed a basic knowledge of Islamic faith and practice. In several instances, Akseki's sermons diverge from an oratory mode of narration, yet become instructive sections from Islamic catechism, outlining the specific rules of fasting during Ramadan, animal sacrifice during Eid al-Adha, or the basics of the Prophet's life, reminding the congregation of authoritative religious symbols, terms, and practices used to shape collective memory. Sermons served as a legitimate public channel to keep the masses connected to religious culture. The following sections illustrate this dynamic field of negotiation and cooperation in greater detail. The Diyanet's 1927 and 1936-37 sermon anthologies offer an abundance of material with which to explore the complexity of the official Islam in the early Republican era. The second anthology incorporates all the sermons published in the initial edition. However, a comparison of the two reveals a slight modification in language rather than content. Following the broader language reformation the Kemalists initiated in the 1930s, Akseki seems to have drawn less on Ottoman or Arabic phrases and instead used more common Turkish words. Following the generic structure, each sermon in the Diyanet's anthologies contained two sections, also called hutbeh, between which the preacher sat and prayed. The first section, birinci hutbeh, is the sermon of admonition, which conveys messages on a particular theme and is delivered in Turkish. The second section, ikinci hutbeh, includes supplication for the ummah in Arabic. Both sermons begin with the praise of God and prayer for the Prophet. While the Friday sermons in both editions are of varying lengths, Akseki advises preachers to cut the sermons mercifully short in the tradition of the Sunnah, so that the attendees may return to work in due time. Akseki was well aware of the risks in formalizing the sermons in response, and to create a feeling of intimacy, sermons adopted a conversational tone and an inclusive we character that avoiding distancing the preacher from the congregation. Most importantly, the texts were mainly written in an accessible plain language, which contrasted all the traditions of divine instruction that generated decorated sermons. Sentences were deliberately kept short, and sermons frequently slipped into colloquial speech, which provided arresting phrases that briefly encapsulated the message of the sermons. In Akseki's words, his sermons spoke to the people in their language. Halk dili ile halka söyleyen. Okay, enlightened Islam. The Diyanet was expected to promote an enlightened Islam supportive of modern science or true Islam against what was considered superstitious or reactionary. The pulpit would be the torch of a Kemalist reformation that would spread the light of this new religion free of dogma, myth, supernatural command, and rites and rituals. This true Islam was instituted in the officially accepted Sunni Hanafi school, excluding what was considered heterodox, such as Alevism or Sufi interpretations. An analysis of early Republican sermons primarily reveals a Puritanist approach that introduced listeners to the direct message of the Islamic canons by eliminating any intermediary figures between God and the individual. Ulema, saints, and sheikhs were erased from the picture. While each sermon displays the Quran and Sunnah as the exclusive normative sources of behavior, references to other sources such as early Muslims are referred to only rarely. Second, the drive for rationalization eliminates any attributes to the metaphysical realm. Despite being a pillar of Islamic creed, celestial beings such as angels were rarely mentioned in the Friday sermons. The angels and Satan are mentioned only 18 and 16 times respectively throughout the 151 sermons. Similarly, despite the extensive depictions of hell and heaven in the Quran, the afterlife was only introduced as an abstract notion. Neither the miracles of the Prophet nor other religious supernatural genres were included in the sermons. Instead, Islam is presented as a tangible set of rules, compliance with which would surely pave the way to worldly progress and moral advancement, as well as infinite happiness in the afterlife. This presentation of ostensibly rationalized religion, however, is intercepted by ulterior motives. First, sermons rarely employ full-fledged argumentation to persuade listeners to follow the fundamental messages. The main body of the sermons largely relies on quoting the Islamic canons, the Quran and Hadith, and their explanation while also providing brief commentaries. Leaning on the textual ethos of normative sources of revelation, they adopt a God says it, that settles it approach. While allocating a whole sermon to the importance of the human mind and wisdom, the mindful and wise are defined as those who defeat their earthly urges and submit themselves to the precedent of the Prophet. Similarly, Muslims are admonished not to question what is assumed to exceed the confines of ordinary mortal knowledge. A closer look at the sermons reveals that they do not deviate from mainstream Sunni Islamic teachings. Instead, they follow the conventional religious language and frames of reference, showing the utmost respect to the sacred realm and rarely utilizing profane discourse. Following the Quran, God is depicted conventionally as He who created men with earth and a drop of water, who created the order in the universe, who shows the way to felicity, and who owns the judgment day. The unique role model for humankind is the Prophet Muhammad. He is depicted as the greatest man in the world, the son of guidance, and the one who radiates light to the earth and the heavens. Likewise, the overwhelming emphasis on morality does not necessarily or exclusively reduce religion to the purity of heart. Sermons frequently exhort that having a Muslim name or faith alone, kuru iman is the exact phrase they use in the sermons, do not lead to salvation, but that fortification through prayer and good deeds is imperative. Yet, most importantly, by incorporating Islam as a marker of national identity and mobilizing it to bolster support for the new regime and its reforms, the intention to nationalize religion contradicts the officially professed ideal to rationalize and privatize religion. As the following section illustrates, sermons promoted an identity that is communitarian rather than individualistic and obedient to the state rather than free and critical. Far from being confined to the private sphere, Islam became the moral ground of citizenship in the Republic. Sermons instructed listeners to do their civic duties, not only as a form of secular obligation, but also as a religious virtue, conflating religious and national values while transforming devout believers into patriotic subjects. Religion and the nation/country are constantly mentioned together as if referring to two inseparably linked elements. For the sake of religion and nation, in the defense of the country and religion, fighting for religion and the country. Islam came to ensure national unity, and believers are exhorted to stand in unison in the face of foreign intervention in the Muslim country. Sermons provided a religious and moral ground through which to communicate the messages of the new ruling elite and incorporate large, traditionally oriented masses into the regime while diminishing the impact of the frustrations and crippling anxieties caused by the socio-political transformation. These are very striking examples I'm just going to mention. Individuals could thus relate to the reforms and see them as intrinsic to their religion and culture. By this conflation, the association of good Muslim to good citizen dominates the sermons. A vivid example of how civic duties are disguised as religious liability is Akseki's translation of a Quranic verse, chapter 9, verse 34, which admonishes those who hoard gold and silver and turn away from national donations in the way of God. Akseki himself inserted the phrase national donations as the original verse contains no such mention. Following the same rationale, a God-fearing individual remains absolutely loyal to his country and nation. Of all these, their duties enumerated in those sermons, like one needs to aid in the defense of the country, financially assist the families of veterans and martyrs, marrying and having children to bolster the country's population, paying taxes, and donating money to the institutions such as the Red Crescent and Turkish Aviation League. These are not presented as civic duties, but as religious duties in the sermons. Of all these duties, the defense of the country takes precedence. 20 sermons touch upon this matter and at times make this point forcefully, even when the sermon does not directly relate to the national defense. The sermons add a sixth pillar to the 5 pillars of Islam, calling for believers to fight the enemy. In addition to God and the Prophet, the state is the only other entity sermons call upon listeners to obey. The state is referred as the pupil of our eyes. Sermons thus typically conclude with the customary practice of praying for the well-being of the state and nation. Nevertheless, considering the broad political, social, and cultural scope of Republican interventions, sermons promoted the basic tenets of the Islamic catechism as well, while managing not to devolve into mere propaganda texts. So even the words like Turk or Turkish were used very rarely. Moreover, the intention to mobilize traditional Islam on multiple occasions precipitated the subversion of the national discourse. While the Kemalist nation building project launched cascading reforms in such fields as language, clothing, and law, sermons did not fully comply with these changes. Reflecting the Kemalist ambition to nationalize religion, the Turkish call to prayer, Ezan, for instance, adopted a purely Turkish term, Tanrı, to replace Allah. However, completely absent in the first edition and only occasional uses of Tanrı, only 2% of the sermons refer to God with many names, and Tanrı appears only as 2% of that. Generally, the word Allah in Arabic is used when God is being addressed. Okay. Let me conclude here. While providing a contextualized historical analysis of First Friday sermons in Turkish, this study warns against arriving at bold conclusions and simple categories about the nature of the Kemalist approach to Islam in the early Republican era. Firstly, consolidating the Kemalist experience under a single overarching category obscures the ideological contradictions and multiple modalities of religious governance. While the early Republican ideology did not form a coherent totality, it maintained diverse and empirically observable expressions regarding Islam. Settling the ambition of creating a secular nation-state and recognizing the limitations of a devastated post-war country, the Kemalist elite shouldered conflicting orientations towards religion. On the one hand, the Enlightenment ideal of reason and the popular philosophy of scientism informed the Kemalist conception of religion. On the other hand, contrasting traditional scholarly works that view Kemalism as a clearly and self-evidently secular project, the Kemalist elite did not cast religion aside and mobilize its community-building capacities to fashion a unified national subject out of a heterogeneous ensemble of existing identities. In addition to deliberately pursuing a grand strategy of Turkifying Islam, as Ziya Gökalp famously suggested, the Kemalist elite sustained pre-existing allegiances in the late empire and exploited the authority and pervasiveness of traditional Islam in the society. So the Kemalists did not choose mechanization over Mecca. Rather, they sought the assistance of Mecca for mechanization. This is a phrase we borrow from Piscatori. We just love that phrase, choosing Mecca over mechanization, or choosing mechanization over Mecca. Kemalists actually sought the assistance of Mecca for mechanization. They succeeded in the case of the sermons, pretty obviously. The Turkish sermons were eventually penned by a prominent Diyanet dignitary with a strong backing of the president of the Diyanet himself, Rıfat Börekçi. Therefore, the Turkish sermon can, in fact, be seen as a religious reform by the Republic's religious establishment. I'll stop here. I hope I didn't talk too much. If you have any questions, I am more than willing to answer. Or if you have feedback, I would definitely love to have them, because this research has not been published yet.
Well done, thank you. Do you have anyone chiming in yet?
No chats yet.
Okay, well, I have a quick question, and this might be a little outside of your scope, so I'm just curious.
Go ahead.
You referenced the vernacularization, as well as the sort of Weberian inner worldness that sort of became infused in these sermons. And I'm just wondering if it's helpful at all or not to use some of the frameworks of the Reformation, the European Reformation, to think about some of the changes happening in Turkey. Is there anything helpful there, or are they just, do you see them as distinct, unrelated entities?
I don't know whether they were very much influenced by the Reformation movement in Europe. They were definitely, the Kemalist elite were definitely influenced by the French Revolution and the French revolutionaries. And some people, in the scholarship, we see people referring to Mustafa Kemal as the Luther of Islam. But whether they themselves in 1920s and 30s, we did not see any sort of evidence that would show us that they were really influenced by Martin Luther or the Reformation movement. But in his own notes, we also studied Mustafa Kemal's notes, his own writings about Islam. Some of them actually found their way into the school textbooks. There are references to the sort of Enlightenment, rationalization. There's a lot of emphasis on reason, human reason. And in the literature, you can sort of find references to Kemalists as the Jacobins, as the Turkish Jacobins. But about the Reformation, I think we must do further research whether to see whether they were inspired by Luther. But I'll definitely take a note of that, actually.
Well, and maybe the point is there isn't a direct correlation there, but rather the ways in which the Reformation influenced the French Revolution may better be reflected in that intermediary sort of moment. If the revolution then influenced Turkish reform, then in a way there might be.
You're very right, because when we talk about vernacularization, it's to do with the Martin Luther's idea of translating the Bible into German vernacular. This is definitely what happened in Turkey. Ziya Gökalp was influenced by Durkheim. I know that, but I don't know whether Durkheim himself was influenced by the Reformation movement. But I think it's a very sort of legitimate question whether they were inspired by that. But that's the thing. They did. The Kemalists instructed the Diyanet to have Quran translated into Turkish, and they actually demanded, or they inquired, or they played or toyed with the idea of conducting prayers in Turkish, but Diyanet resisted vehemently. Diyanet said that no, verses during the prayers cannot be recited in a language other than Arabic. Ahmet Hamdi Akseki, the author of these sermons, actually, he dragged feet, and he actually infuriated one of close associates of Mustafa Kemal, Hikmet Bayur, because they discussed this matter. Hikmet Bayur referred to Ebu Hanife, who allegedly issued a fatwa allowing the recitation of the verses in one's vernacular. Akseki said no, he retracted from that. So he retracted. I mean, he did issue that fatwa, but he
took it back. So they dragged feet, and even though Quran was translated into Turkish, it's still in Turkey. It's, faithful Muslims, while they're praying, they do recite the verses in Arabic, even though they don't really understand what those verses mean.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I wanna make sure.
We have one question.
Okay.
This is from Rachel Scott. She said, "Thank you very much, Vistami. This was really interesting. I am interested in your opening reference to the fact that these sermons increasingly emphasize the prophet as someone who wanted to change society for the better. Did a more rationalist approach to the Quran and to Muhammad lead to any arguments, such as those of Montalites, that the Quran was created as opposed to uncreated? I'm really interested in the phrase religion Turkism. I might have missed it, but can you tell me who first coined this phrase and what was the corresponding Turkish?"
Okay, religious Turkism. It's a phrase by Ziya Gökalp, who is considered as the founding father of Turkish nationalism. He's considered as the chief ideologue of Turkish nationalism. Ziya Gökalp used that phrase. He coined that phrase. Dini Türkçülük in Turkish. He used that phrase in his perhaps the masterpiece, Foundations of Turkism, Türkçülüğün esasları. So he used that. But this, the positivistic language used about Islam and the reference to prophet as a concerned man, we found that in the history textbook rather than the sermons, because in the sermons, Muhammad is treated with tremendous respect. All these traditional epithets used before, like Resul-i Zishan, Resulullah Efendimiz, our master, the messenger of God, they were preserved in those sermons. In the history textbook, the history textbooks, they refer Muhammad as a concerned man. So, for example, there's this. I don't know whether Professor Scott can see that, but this is a page from one of those history textbooks published in 1933. Muhammad, he is referred with his name only, and according to the traditional Islam, you can't do that. You have to use epithets that shows your veneration. But here it's just he's referred to as Muhammad, and here again Muhammad. So as if he's like, Muhammad appeared by saying that I'm the messenger of God, but he didn't do it suddenly. It was after a certain period of time. So it's just he's treated as a sort of a secular person, just another person who was concerned about his society, the situation of the pre-Islamic Arabia. So he wanted to change things, just like a regular person. This is how he's treated. But when it came to the sermons, Peygamberimiz Muhammed, our Prophet Muhammad. So he's not referred with his name only. So and throughout the text, epithets like Resul Zishan, glorious prophet, Efendimiz, our Lord, actually is going to be the literal translation. So in the sermons, he's referred with more traditional usages, with a lot of respect. That's actually one of the reasons why we're sort of conducted this research, because we knew the history textbooks are investigated already by scholars, by prominent scholars of the field, like Akile Zorlu-Turkan. She has a fantastic article on the school textbooks. But the sermons remain unexplored, and when we studied the sermons, we were kind of surprised that around the same time, these are two texts published by the same government, but Muhammad is referred differently. So that was one of the things why actually we conducted this research. And the second one is the Turkish version of the language of Ezan was changed in 1932, but technically in 1934, and Ezan was recited in Turkey until 1950 in Turkish. But even in Turkish, Muhammad was referred with a lot of respect. Tanrı'nın elçisi, messenger of God. They did not dispute that, or they didn't use any sort of reference as if you would tempted to feel that they were questioning his quality as being messenger of God. No, they used the Turkish phrase, and they actually sort of preached that version atop the minaret at least 5 times a day. So these are like 3 different depictions of Muhammad around the same time. And all these are government productions. The same government produced those. I hope I answered Professor Scott's question. If there's any other sort of further question I would definitely like to have, or any feedback, I would much appreciate that.
Is there any more in the chat? I do have one more question too.
Sure.
You know, you're highlighting and I realize the project is to look at the sermons, but do we know anything about the reception of the sermons? Like, how were Muslims in the mosque receiving the messages? Like, was it acceptable, or was there conflict? Like, what was the reception like?
Yeah, we deal with that in our draft. This is a very long draft. It's not a book. It's going to come out hopefully in the shape of an article. There we discuss how the sermons in Turkish were received by the congregation, and we compare that reception with how the Turkish azan was received and how the Turkish translation of Quran was received. There was immense unhappiness on the part of the Diyanet about the recitation of Quran in Turkish. We discussed that with you already. And when the azan was recited in Turkish, there were sporadic public protests across the country. And certain muezzins refused to recite the azan in Turkish. Some of them were actually prosecuted. Some of them actually recited the azan in Arabic first, but with a very lower voice, and then recited the azan in Turkish later. Some of the muezzins, imams, preachers, they found mentally unstable people. They asked them to recite the adhan in Arabic. And when the law enforcement came over and questioned what was going on, they just said, well, he's doing it and he's mentally unstable. We can't prosecute that person, because they could not make peace with the idea of reciting the adhan in a language other than Arabic, because Arabic is not just a language, or was not received just as a language in early Turkey. It was considered as the lisan ad-din, the language of the religion. So it had its own sacredness in itself. But when it came to the sermons, everybody was fine with it. No public protest. Nobody said anything. And one of the reasons why people did not protest or left the mosques during the sermon, the first reason is that it was not complete in Turkish. The admonition part was in Turkish, but the prayers were still being recited in Arabic. And the hadith was, again, not only the Quranic verses, but the hadith also, they were being recited in Arabic. Secondly, this was an old discussion. So already during the Ottoman times, people were discussing that. So when this thing was being debated in early Turkey, people were not surprised. They didn't say, oh, where did this come from? So they were already sort of intimate. They were already sort of familiar with the idea of the Turkish sermon. And as I said, incidentally, it's one of the longest surviving Kemalist reforms. Still in Turkey, the sermons are being delivered, half of it actually, in Turkish. And still sermons are being used for political purposes. This is from 2018. This is how a preacher delivers the Friday sermon. And he asks the congregation to be thrifty, and he asks the congregation to do business in Turkish lira rather than in US dollars because of the exchange rate. There's another excerpt. This is from Newsweek. So again, even today, and Islamists of all walks of life, the Sufi Brotherhood, they're all fine with it. Nobody questioned actually this switch to Turkish.
Can I ask one more follow-up question?
Please.
Was there any regional differences in how well this was taken up? Was it primarily initiated in urban centers and then rural centers sort of adapted the same, or was it more universal than that?
It was universal. That's one of the things we were particularly interested in, areas where Turkish was not spoken.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of having the sermon in Turkish is to make the sermon legible to the audience. But not all people in Turkey in 1920s and 1930s spoke Turkish at home. But we couldn't find any evidence. For example, in Kurdish-speaking areas, when an imam got on top of the pulpit and delivered the sermon in Turkish, did it make any difference to the congregation? Because Arabic or Turkish, it didn't matter, because if they didn't speak any other language than Kurmanchi, for example, how did they receive? We couldn't find any evidence about that. But once the sermons were published, they sent the copies all across the country. So it was a sort of a universal, to put it in your own phrase, actually, it was a universal sort of attempt to have the sermons delivered in Turkish all across the country. But that's a very legitimate question. And about the reaction, for example, we don't know how, for example, Comanche speakers reacted, because we couldn't find any evidence. But that's a very important thing to consider, actually. I hope we can find and we can conduct another research on that.
Yeah, we did have a follow-up from Rachel Scott. How did the Kemalist government regulate who was qualified to give sermons, i.e. who was able to be an imam? Was the government able to nominate all imams, or were their mosques and leaderships of which were beyond its control?
That's a very good question. They tried to have the sermons delivered by government officials only. That was the idea. But whether they could enforce that, that's something else, because many things, they would decide on certain things in the parliament in Ankara, and they would send instructions to the provinces, but whether they would be enforced is something else. But they sent circulars in late 1920s and in 1930s as well. In case there were people who were not authorized to deliver sermon, the muftis were being warned harshly, saying that we have information that a person who was not authorized to delivered the sermon. Please make sure that this doesn't happen again. So we found documents in the archives in Ankara pertaining to this matter. So they did their utmost to make sure that government officials, imams who were government officials, delivered those sermons. But whether they were successful 100%, not really, because not all mosques in the country had government appointed imams. We do know that there were wandering imams, who, like seasonal imams, they would do for their livelihood. They would travel mosques, especially in mountainous regions like northeast Turkey, southeast Turkey. The people would pay them not only in cash, but in like wheat or corn. They would give them food. So I'm not sure that they had a full control over the sort of the delivery of service. This is what they attempted, but whether they were successful is another sort of topic.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you, Vistami. Anything else you want to share before?
No, I'm very grateful for the questions and the feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.